every security update your phone installs overnight exists because of one night in November 1988 and because of a single number chosen wrongly by a graduate student. At about 8:30 in the evening on the 2nd of November, a program was released onto the internet from a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Within 24 hours, it had hit an estimated 6,000 of the roughly 60,000 computers then connected to the entire network. It stole nothing. It deleted nothing. It carried no weapon of any kind. It simply copied itself, and the copying alone was enough to bring machines to a standstill. The person who wrote it said he wanted to measure how big the internet was. A court later decided that his intention was not the question that mattered. In the next half hour, I want to show you exactly what went wrong, why 1 chance in 7 is the whole story, and how this accident built the thing that answers the phone when the internet breaks today. Let us set the scene properly, because the internet of 1988 is not a smaller version of the one you use. It is a different kind of thing entirely. It was mostly universities, research laboratories, and a few government sites. Roughly 60,000 machines, not 60,000 users. 60,000 computers, most of them shared by whole departments. The people on it largely knew each other, or knew somebody who did. It had been built by researchers, for researchers, on the working assumption that everybody connected to it was a colleague. That assumption was not naive. It was accurate for about 20 years. The network was small enough that bad behavior carried a social cost, and there was nobody else on it to worry about. So the machines were built to be helpful. They would tell a stranger who was currently logged in, they would accept mail and act on it. They would let a trusted machine run a command without asking twice. Every one of those helpful behaviors was a door, and every door stood open because closing doors was not something anybody had needed to think about yet. On the evening of the 2nd of November, a program went through those doors. It was released from an MIT machine, which matters because the person who wrote it was not at MIT. He was a graduate student at Cornell, launching from a machine several hundred miles away, disguised where it had come from, and for a while, that worked. The design was, in outline, simple. Get onto a machine. Look at that machine to find other machines it talks to, copy yourself across to those. Then repeat, outward, forever. That is the definition of a worm, as distinct from a virus. A virus needs a host program and a human to run it. A worm travels on its own, machine to machine, with nobody helping it. The word had existed in fiction and in research papers for years. What had never existed was one loose on a real network at real scale. And here is the part that surprises people. The program was small. It was not a masterwork. Much of it was a short piece whose only job was to pull the rest of itself across the wire. It also tried, quite hard, to stay hidden. It kept a low profile in the machine's list of running programs, and it cleaned up after itself wherever it could. Those two things together, a small program that hides, are why the people fighting it spent most of the night simply working out what they were looking at. But none of that is why it did damage. The damage came from something its author was actively trying to prevent. So how did it get from one machine to the next? 3 routes. I'm going to describe them as categories rather than as instructions, because 2 of them still describe classes of bug that exist today. The first was a flaw in a program whose entire job was to answer a harmless question: who is logged in on this machine right now, a perfectly reasonable thing to be running in 1988. The flaw was that the program accepted an answer longer than the space it had set aside to hold it. Send it too much, and the excess spilled into memory it should never have been able to reach. That class of bug has a name, and it has been the single most productive category of software vulnerability in the history of the field. It is still being found in code written this year. The second route used a feature in the program that handled electronic mail. The feature had been left switched on in a great many ship systems, and it let mail do rather more than deliver a message. It was a debugging convenience. Somebody had needed it during development. It was genuinely useful, and turning it off before shipping was not something anybody had a process for. The third route was the oldest and the least technical of all. It simply guessed passwords. And it guessed well. It carried a short list of a few hundred likely words. It tried the account name itself. It tried the account name spelled backwards. It tried the user's own name in the obvious variations. And it worked on a meaningful fraction of accounts, on machines belonging to some of the most technically sophisticated institutions on the planet. That is not a story about 1988. Every published analysis of breaches since has put some version of that same finding near the top of the list. Once it was on a machine, it used the trust that machine already had. Systems were configured to accept commands from other machines they considered friendly without checking again. So a single compromised machine in a department was never one machine. It was a key to every machine that trusted it, and those machines trusted others in turn. That property, where access to one system becomes access to many because of trust configured for convenience, is what makes a modern breach expensive. It is not new. It is here in 1988, fully formed. And I want to be clear about what I am deliberately leaving out. I am not naming the programs, I am not describing the sequences, and none of this is followable by anybody watching. It is all fixed. It has been fixed for decades, and the interesting part was never the method anyway. The interesting part is what happened once it was let go. The program was written by Robert Tappan Morris. He was 23 years old. He had graduated from Harvard in June of that year and had just started as a graduate student at Cornell. He is alive, and he has had a long career since, so I am going to be careful in this section. What follows is public record and what the courts found. Nothing else and no guessing. There is one biographical fact everybody mentions, and it is verified, so here it is once, and then we move on. His father, also called Robert Morris, was a cryptographer who worked at the National Security Agency at the time. I am not going to speculate about what that meant inside that household, because nobody outside it knows, and the speculation adds nothing at all to what actually happened. What matters for the story is that he was, by every account including the courts, a capable programmer at a serious institution, working on a network he understood extremely well. He was not an outsider attacking a system from a distance. He was a member of the community that had built the thing, using knowledge that community shared openly among itself. And that openness is part of the story. Several of the weaknesses the program used were already known. They had been discussed. Some of them had fixes available that sites had simply not applied. There was no mechanism to make anybody apply them. No advisory service, no central address, no expectation that an administrator should be tracking security news, because there was no security news to track. His stated purpose, in his own later description, was to gauge the size of the internet. I am reporting that as his account, because that is exactly what it is. The court, when it eventually got there, did not have to decide whether that was true. It decided a much narrower and far more interesting question, and we will come to it. What can be said without dispute is that the outcome went very far beyond what the program was built to do, and that he tried to stop it once that was clear. Within hours, a message went out across the network explaining how to defend against it. It included instructions for stopping the spread. It arrived late, and it arrived by the worst possible route. It was sent over the network. The program was busy congesting, so the people who needed it most did not receive it for a very long time. There is something almost unbearable in that detail. The antidote was stuck in the traffic jam caused by the disease. To understand why there was a traffic jam at all, you have to understand what he was actually trying to build. Counting the internet sounds trivial. It was not, and understanding why is the key to everything that follows in this episode. There was no central list. Nobody owned the network. It had grown by institutions connecting to other institutions, and no single organization could tell you how many machines were on it. You could not simply ask. No service existed that would answer the question, and even if you asked every machine you knew about, you would only ever learn about machines those machines knew about. So a census of a network like that has to walk. It has to reach a machine, look around, find the neighbors, go there, and repeat, all the way out to the edges. And the hours that takes add up. And if you want a real number rather than a guess, the thing doing the walking has to survive. It has to still be running when it finally gets to the far side of the network. Which means it cannot be polite. A program that quietly exits whenever anybody objects will never finish the walk. It has to persist, and it has to spread faster than it gets cleaned up. Now you can see the shape of the trap. The requirements for a census of a decentralized network and the requirements for an out-of-control worm are very nearly the same requirements. There is exactly one thing separating them: the ability to recognize a machine you have already visited and to leave it alone. Get that right, and you have a survey tool. Get it wrong, and you have a machine that keeps arriving at the same door forever, letting itself in every time. He knew this. That is the important part. He was not careless about it. He built in a check specifically to handle exactly this problem. The check worked like this. Before installing itself, the program would ask the machine whether a copy was already there. If the answer came back yes, the new arrival would stop. That is the correct design. Had it been left there, the program would have walked the network, counted it, and most people would never have known it had happened at all. But he was worried about something else, and the worry was entirely reasonable. If the check were that simple, anybody who worked out what was happening could defeat it trivially. They could just make every machine answer yes. Say the copy is already here, whether it is or not, and the program politely goes away, and the census quietly dies. So he added a defense against that defense, and that decision, one line of caution against a hypothetical opponent, is what took down the early internet. Because the way you defend against a machine that always says yes is to sometimes not believe it. Oi! The program was written so that even when a machine reported it was already infected, roughly 1 time in 7, the new copy would install itself anyway. Read that back slowly, because it is the entire disaster in a single sentence. 1 in 7, not 1 in 1,000, not 1 in 1,000,000, 1 in 7. It is a rational sounding defense. If somebody is lying to shut you out, ignoring them occasionally means you cannot be shut out completely. As a piece of reasoning, it is perfectly sound. As a rate, it is catastrophic. And the reason is that machines were not being visited once. On a well-connected network, a machine gets approached again and again and again. Every approach is a fresh roll of the dice. 6 times out of 7, nothing happens. The 7th time, another copy installs itself and starts running. And copies do not politely wait their turn. Each one immediately begins doing what it was built to do, looking for neighbors, opening connections, spreading further outward. So on a busy machine, copies accumulate. 2, then 5, then dozens, each consuming processor time and memory, each generating traffic of its own to go and find more machines. There is no destructive instruction anywhere in any of this. Nothing is deleted, nothing is stolen, nothing is even read that matters to anybody. The machine simply runs out of memory, out of processing capacity, out of any ability to do the work it was actually there to do. It grinds down, and then it stops answering. An administrator seeing this would do the obvious thing: restart the machine, clear it out, bring it back up, and get on with the day. And within a short time, it would be reinfected from a neighboring machine still running copies, and the whole thing would begin again. The alarm never actually stopped ringing. That is why this incident is remembered as an attack. From the outside, it behaved exactly like one. It came back after removal. It resisted cleanup. It spread while you were fighting it. But there was no attacker steering anything. The behavior that looked like intelligence was one probability constant, set too high, running on a network that connected everything to everything else. I would argue this is the most important single lesson available from this whole episode, and it has almost nothing to do with security. A number buried in a retry rule, and a piece of code that almost nobody would ever review was load-bearing for the entire system it ran on. Nobody discovered that by reading it. They discovered it at 8:30 on a Wednesday evening, all at once, everywhere. The first signs were not dramatic. A machine somewhere gets slow. Somebody notices, assumes a runaway program, kills it, and goes back to work. Then it happens again. Then a colleague mentions the same thing on a different machine. Then somebody at another institution entirely mentions it too. Within a few hours, sites across the country were watching their machines saturate. And the thing they needed most urgently was the exact thing that had just been taken away from them. They needed to talk to each other, and the network they would have used to do that was the network currently falling over. Electronic mail was queuing, or not moving at all. Some sites disconnected themselves entirely to stop the spread, which also cut them off from everybody working on the Bravo. A silence fell across whole regions of the network. So the response ran on telephones. People rang people they knew personally. Somebody with a colleague at another university called them at home and read things down the line. That is not a colorful detail. The coordinated defense of the internet on its first genuinely bad night ran on the personal address books of a few dozen people. Meanwhile, teams at a handful of institutions were doing something genuinely impressive. They were taking the program apart while it was still running to work out what it actually did. They had no copy of the original. They had a running program that hid itself and cleaned up after itself on machines that kept falling over underneath them while they worked. They worked through the night. By morning, working in parallel and comparing notes over whatever channel still functioned, they had the shape of it. They understood it spread 3 ways. They understood it did not destroy data, which mattered enormously, because until you know that, you are obliged to assume the very worst. And crucially, they worked out the reinfection behavior, which explained why cleaning a machine was not enough, and why the only way out was to close the doors first and clean afterwards. That sequence, contain and then clean, is now standard practice in every incident response process in the world. It was worked out overnight, by people who had not slept, on machines that kept dying. By the 3rd day, the spread was under control. Fixes were circulating, sites were reconnecting. The whole thing was over almost as fast as it had begun. And then everybody sat back and asked the question that had never needed asking before, because nothing like this had ever happened. What exactly do we do next time? Because there was certainly going to be a next time, and there was no answer at all. The reaction inside the community was not unanimous, and the split is worth knowing about, because the same split is still going on today. One camp was straightforwardly furious. Real work had been destroyed. Research had been interrupted. People had lost days. Whatever the intention was, the effect was damage on a very large scale. Another camp argued that the weaknesses were real, that they were already known, and that a demonstration which broke nothing permanently was cheaper than finding out the hard way later. There is a version of that second argument which is self-serving, and a version which is serious, and it is worth carefully separating the two. The self-serving version says any exposure of a flaw is a public service, regardless of consent, scale, or consequence. That argument has not aged well, and it did not persuade a court. The serious version asks who is responsible for a known flaw that nobody has fixed. That question eventually produced everything we now call responsible disclosure. Somebody, somewhere, had to be able to be called. Because before this, there was no answer. If you found a serious problem in software that thousands of institutions were running, there was simply nowhere to report it. You could tell the author, if you could find them. You could post it publicly, which told everybody, including whoever wanted to use it. Or you could say nothing at all. None of those is a good option, and everybody knew it. What was missing was an institution, somewhere to send a warning that would reach the people who needed it quickly and quietly. The other thing missing was a shared idea of what any of this even was. Was it vandalism? Was it trespass? Was it research that got away from somebody? The law had no settled answer either, which is why the case that followed matters enormously, far beyond the one man it was about. There was also a hard, practical question underneath the ethics, and it was about the shape of the network itself. The design assumption of the early internet was that participants were trustworthy. That assumption had just been demonstrated to be a load-bearing wall rather than a preference. You could not simply remove it. The helpfulness was the product. A network where machines refuse to talk to each other is not a network at all. What you could do was stop assuming and start verifying, and accept that doing so would make everything slower and more irritating forever. That is the bargain everybody on the internet has lived under ever since, and it was struck in the weeks after, November 1988. Now, the numbers. And this is the part where a famous statistic deserves a great deal more skepticism than it usually gets. The figure you will hear everywhere is that the worm took down 10% of the internet. It is in documentaries, in textbooks, and in the headline of almost every anniversary article written. Here is where it comes from. An estimated 6,000 machines were hit, out of approximately 60,000 then connected. 6 over 60 is 10%. Both of those are estimates. The 6,000 is described as an estimate in every primary account, including the FBI's own. The 60,000 is an approximation of a network nobody could count. Which is, of course, the joke. The reason nobody could give you a precise number is precisely the reason the program was written in the first place. So the correct way to say it is an estimated 10%, arrived at by dividing one estimate by another of a network whose true size was genuinely unknown. That is still a lot. It is just not a measurement. I'm not saying this to be pedantic. I'm saying it because those records have been repeated for nearly 40 years without anybody rederiving them, and that is worth noticing in itself. The money figure attached to this incident is even better than the machine count. And by better, I mean very considerably worse. The United States Government Accountability Office estimated the damage at somewhere between $100,000 and $10 million. That is a range of 100 to 1. If somebody told you a house costs between $10,000 and $1 million, you would not call that a valuation. You would call it a shrug. And again, the reason is not incompetence. Nobody knew how to price a day of unavailable research computing because nothing had ever needed to be priced that way before. With the cost, the staff hours spent fighting it, the research delayed, the value of the machines while they sat idle, each of those gives a wildly different answer, and none of them was standard. So the honest summary is this. It hit thousands of machines out of tens of thousands. It cost an amount nobody could establish. And it destroyed no data whatsoever. That last point is the one most often lost. For all the damage to time and work and sleep, not one file was deleted by this program and not one piece of information was stolen. Which raises the question the legal system now had to answer and had absolutely no precedent for. If nothing was taken and nothing was broken, what exactly was the crime? The answer came from a law that was 2 years old and had never been properly tested. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act passed in 1986. The case became United States versus Morris. It produced the first conviction under that act, which is why it appears in essentially every legal textbook on computer crime written since. In December 1990, he was sentenced. 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, a fine of $10,050, plus the costs of his supervision. He did not go to prison. I want to state that plainly, because a great many retellings of this story strongly imply that he did. He appealed, and the appeal is the part that actually mattered to everybody else. It was argued in the halls of the Second Circuit, and the conviction was affirmed in March of 1991. The question on appeal was narrow and enormous at the same time. The statute talked about accessing a computer without authorization and causing damage. The argument was about what the word intentionally attached to. Did the law require that he intended to cause the damage, or was it enough that he intended the unauthorized access, with the damage simply following from it? If intent to damage were required, he had a real defense. There is no serious evidence he wanted machines to fall over. The entire design was aimed at avoiding exactly that outcome. The court held that intent to gain unauthorized access was sufficient. The damage did not have to be intended for the conduct to be criminal. That reading is the foundation of decades of computer crime prosecution that followed, and it is still argued over by lawyers who think it swept far too broadly. Because notice what it means in practice. Under that reading, a person who genuinely intends only to look and who causes harm by accident and at scale has still committed the offense. You can think That is exactly right, and there is a strong case that it is. A tool that touches every machine on a network is not a passive act, whatever its author meant by it. You can also see why people worry about it. The same reasoning can reach a researcher probing a system in order to warn its owner, and that tension has never been fully resolved. What is not in dispute is the effect on the field. After this case, the argument that somebody was going to do something useful stopped being a defense in an American courtroom. And that changed behavior. It is a large part of why modern security testing is wrapped in written permission before anybody touches anything, which is something this channel looked at in a recent episode on penetration testers. So a program with no payload, written by a student who meant to count things, produced the founding case law of computer crime. It also produced something a good deal more useful than case law, and it produced it within days rather than years. Within days of the incident, still in November 1988, before anybody had finished counting the machines, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency acted. It tasked the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University with standing up a center to coordinate communication among security and computer experts during emergencies. That became the CERT Coordination Center. Days, not a committee, not a review, not a report in 18 months. And the reason it happened that fast is that the previous week had made the gap embarrassingly obvious. There had been no number to call. There had been no list of who to warn. The whole defense had run on personal phone calls between people who happened to know each other, and everybody involved understood exactly how badly that scales. What CERT introduced was mundane and transformative at once. A known address for reports, a way to verify a problem, a way to notify affected parties in a coordinated way rather than a chaotic one. That model spread. Today there are national response teams in most countries and internal ones inside large organizations, and every one of them traces its shape back to this. The other inheritance is a set of habits so ordinary now that they are invisible. Software that updates itself, advisories with severity ratings. The expectation that a vendor has somewhere to receive bad news? None of that existed before November 1988, and none of it was invented by anybody sitting down to design a discipline. It was assembled, quickly and defensively, by people who had just spent 3 days discovering that the network they had built had no immune system whatsoever. There is one more legacy, and it is the least comfortable one. This incident is the reason the field's default assumption changed. Before it, the assumption was that participants were colleagues and that the failure mode worth worrying about was accident. After it, the assumption was that participants might be anybody at all, which is, in a sense, a loss. Something real was given up that week, and the people who were on the network before it tend to describe it as the end of something. But the alternative was never keeping the old internet. The old internet was already gone, because it had just been shown that 60,000 trusting machines could be brought to a halt by one person who did not even intend it. The only real question was whether anybody would notice before somebody tried it on purpose. That week, they noticed. So what do you take away from this? 4 things, and not one of them requires you to work in security. First, most outages are accidents, not attacks. The most famous incident in early internet history had no target, no payload, and nobody steering it anywhere. So next time you are staring at an outage, ask what changed and what is retrying before you. Ask who did this to us. That order gets you to the answer faster, far more often. Second, and this is the one I would have tattooed somewhere, a retry rule is a load-bearing decision. 1 in 7 was the entire disaster, so look for the number that decides how often something tries again and give it as much scrutiny as the thing it is retrying. It almost never gets any. Third, when a damage figure spans a 100-fold range, it is not a measurement. $100,000 to $10 million is not a number. It is an admission. So ask yourself who produced the figure and what they were actually able to count. The confident round number in a headline is very often just 2 estimates divided by each other. Fourth, it only measured things is not a defense that survives contact with scale. The court held that intending the access was enough. A read-only tool that touches every machine on a network is not a read-only event, because the touching itself costs something on every machine it reaches. That principle now governs a great deal more than security. It applies to any automated process let loose against systems that other people are depending on. Next Monday on The Hack That Changed Everything, the first time an entire country was taken offline. Estonia, 2007, and what happens when the target is not a company, but a nation. It is the moment this subject stopped being about machines and started being about states. Thank you for watching, and I will see you then.